Hello, everyone. I am Celeste Rodriguez-Luro. I am live, ao vivo, from the University of Western Australia campus. The University of Western Australia sits on the still unceded lands of the Noongar people. I would like to pay my respects to their elders, leaders, and communities. I would also like to acknowledge the First Nations peoples of all the lands in which we live and work. Abralin ao Vivo Linguists Online is an innovative event run by the Brazilian Linguistics Association in collaboration with many linguistic societies and groups, some of which include la Asociación de Lingüística y Filología de América Latina, la Sociedad Argentina de Estudios Lingüísticos, the Linguistic Society of America, the Linguistics Association of Great Britain, and the Australian Linguistic Society. Abralin ao Vivo has been a bright light during really difficult times, and it has set a solid precedent for new and exciting ways of doing things. Today, I am thrilled to be able to introduce Professor Nicholas Evans. He is Distinguished Professor in the Department of Linguistics at the Australian National University in Canberra. He is an Australian Research Council Laureate Fellow and the Director of the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for the Dynamics of Language. Nick, as he is affectionately known, is a bright, influential intellectual and a highly accomplished linguist and social scientist. But he is also a dear mentor and teacher, and I couldn't be more grateful for the opportunity to introduce him today. I still remember Nick's supportive presence at my first ever conference presentation. It was the 2006 meeting of the Australian Linguistic Society in Brisbane. I also remember his encouragement to open my wings and fly when I graduated with my PhD. That presence meant so much for so many reasons, not the least because I was a newly arrived migrant with so much to learn, both in terms of academic content, but also regarding how to live and thrive in a brand new city, country, and continent, and in a foreign language. His enthusiasm and support meant so much, and I know, because I have heard it from so many others, that generations of linguists in Australia and internationally would agree with me. Nick says it took him a long time to realize that he wanted to become a linguist. He grew up in Canberra in the 1960s, and he describes his childhood as resolutely monoglot, but his destiny was in linguistics. After finishing his master's, Nick was headed for China, but instead of traveling to Beijing to teach English in what he has described as an attempt to no longer be a poor student, he was persuaded by Bob Dixon to do a PhD in linguistics. Nick spent the next 3 years conducting fieldwork with speakers of Kayardild, an endangered Australian language spoken in the northwest of Australia. He was immediately northeast of Australia. He was immediately welcomed into the Kayardild world, and that warm reception, Nick says, was everything in getting him hooked as a field linguist. Since then, Nick has worked across a range of areas and with many collaborators the world over. He has had many other fieldwork experiences, including in Aran Land and Papua New Guinea. Today, he is a leading expert in endangered languages. His research interests include the Indigenous languages of Australia and Papua New Guinea, linguistic typology, historical and contact linguistics, semantics, and the mutual influence of language and culture. Nick is a prolific writer. He has authored hundreds of academic publications throughout his career, from his influential 2009 article in Behavioral and Brain Sciences, co-authored with Stephen Levinson, entitled The Myth of Language Universals, Language Diversity and Its Importance for Cognitive Science, to his popular 2010 book, Dying Words, Endangered Languages and What They Have to Tell Us. He has also supervised and mentored the next generation, or should I say generations, of linguists in Australia and beyond, and has always remained approachable and open to dialogue and growth. Today, he will deliver a lecture titled Who's Here and Who's There? double perspective, and the grammar of social cognition. Nick, over to you.
Thank you, Celeste. Is that all showing up okay? One second. Okay, you've got my screen. It's on presenter mode. Okay,
perfect.
Everything's running. Thank you. Look, so thank you, Celeste, for your very kind words of introduction. And a big thank you to Miguel Oliveira and to Abralin for this amazing, amazing innovation in the face of terrible times. I can't say how much I admire the courage and vision of our Brazilian colleagues in doing this at such a terrible time and in shining this beam of hope around the world in the language sciences. So just as Celeste did, I, for my part, would like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri elders here in Canberra, past, present, and emerging on the country on whose lands I'm standing, and whose sovereignty over this place has never been ceded. And perhaps because we have a worldwide audience, I should just add that this is part of the ongoing process of Australia coming to terms with its often terrible past, when there was no treaty, no recognition of prior and now ongoing Indigenous ownership over this continent. So in the last few years, this process of acknowledgement of country has come in, and it's a groundswell. I think it's a very important recognition. But I'd also like to make the point that in saying these words here in Abralin to a group of people around the world, it's slightly different from saying it in Canberra in a seminar room, for example, because we need to contextualize it, explain a little more, and even a question of what here means and of who the local tribe, the local owners are, is different. And this takes us to the idea introduced by Bell in 1984 of audience design, which is so fundamental in language. We have an audience from around the world. I could say, good morning, everyone, and that makes total sense for my Australian and New Zealand colleagues. If I were to say, good afternoon, y'all, or something, then for our Hawaiian colleagues, that's right. For our poor British colleagues who are maybe having to wake up in the middle of the night, if anyone set their alarm to do that, and I say, good evening, everybody, you know who I'm talking to by that choice of time expression. And same, maybe some of my Portuguese-speaking colleagues might find it a bit funny if I say bom dia a todos. But for Portuguese-speaking colleagues in Timor-Leste, that would be the right thing to say, as opposed to boa noite a todos. And then for Spanish-speaking colleagues, depending whether they're in Mexico, and I say buenas tardes a todos, or in Spain or somewhere, then I would choose the address differently. So this is something that starts with almost the first thing you say in language. You have to step into your audience's shoes, but sometimes that's a long stride, as you can see from those two little cartoons. And I'd like to talk today about some of the ways that languages force us to do that all the time, not just in choosing a greeting, but in the very core of their grammars. So let's start with space. We're all having to think about space at the moment, and of course, it's reflected in the title of my talk. And if we just think about demonstrative systems, words for this and that, and so on, languages are really interesting in how much they vary. And you can have a basically distance-based speaker system anchored on the speaker. So in Spanish, it's often described like this. I mean, all of these things that I'm saying are a little oversimplified, But the normal descriptions of Spanish are that if I say este or esta, something here with me, and then I can go further away from me to ese and esa, which we might translate as that, and then way off to aquel, aquella, which we might have translated as yon in English a long time ago. But those are all calculated from me as the anchor. Now, Japanese also has a three-way system, but the logic is a little different to Spanish, because if I say kore, here, this one near me, and I say sore, sore is not just further from me, but it's close to you. So if I'm talking to Celeste and it's right there in her domain, I would say sore. And if I say are, it's from both of us. So now we're starting to build in that very basic dyad of a conversation between a speaker and addressee, talking about the world who are around them, and putting that into the internal logic of the demonstrative system. And in Japanese, as many of you will know, there's a whole large series of different demonstratives built on these three roots of ko and so and a. Now, when we look at a language like Turkish, we still have a three-way system, but the logic changes again. And this is something we've only begun to understand in the last 2 decades or so, thanks to the work of Asli Özürek, who can see there, you can see there, and Sotoro Kita. So people had, of course, talked about Turkish for hundreds of years, but had never quite understood what the basis of the system was. And the work I'm mentioning now, you've got the references there at the bottom, was possible because instead of just looking at texts or grammatical analyses, they actually got out there with video cameras and filmed language in interaction until they could see what was really going on. So if something is near the speaker, like near me, and I know you're also attending to it, so, okay, I hold up my mobile phone, I'm pointing to it, I assume by now you're looking at it, I would say bu. Near me, joint attention. If it's far from me, let's say that bookshelf way back there at the back of the room, but we've still got joint attention, I hope you're looking at it by now, then I would say oh. And all of these have more complex forms built on them. So I'm just labeling a series of demonstratives with these. The interesting one is shu. And that is what gets used before joint attention has been established. The distance is unspecified. What's important about it is, I don't think you are yet paying attention to this. So here is how things looked in their work. So that among other things, they recorded people in a pottery studio, and we have the first, the teacher is looking for a pot to make a point about a particular way of designing, and the student's actually ahead of the teacher here, and she's seen an example before he has up on the shelf, and she points to it. I've taken the or out from a more complicated sentence here just to make it clearer for current purposes. So she points up and says, oh, sir, pot is up there. Now you can see that she's focusing on it, but sorry, she says there's shu, a pot up there. She's focusing on it, but he hasn't trained his gaze yet. And then she keeps referring to it with shu, because he's moving towards looking at it, but hasn't got there yet. And then in the third slide, when their gazes are aligned and she knows, okay, he knows what I'm talking about now, at that point, she moves to using the or form. So this shows how the correct use of demonstratives, it's not just about locating objects in space, but it's also about training your interlocutor's attention to align with yours so that we are attending to the same world. Now that's pretty cool and something fairly new, but language continues to surprise us. And this is one of the great reasons why the world's 7,000 languages are so important, because there's many lessons for the language sciences, but also I would say for our understanding of human possibility more generally to be discovered in a language or here or there that maybe we don't know about yet. So I'd like to talk about another language called Abui, which is a Papuan language spoken in the islands of southeastern Indonesia and has been described in some quite amazing work by František Kratochvíl, who you can see on the left, and Benny del Parra, who's the young man in the middle of the middle photograph. So he's there with an older man who was like a really amazing speaker, and then an Indonesian documentation team there. So basically what Abui does is cross a system like Japanese, where you look at close to or far from individuals, with a system like Spanish, where you're looking at degrees of distance. So again, I was very lucky that František and Benny del Parra were helping me get these examples together of oversimplified things, but it's just to show how they would work in the current context. So imagine now I'm talking to Miguel in Sao Paulo, and we're trying to communicate about things. And the first example, the do series, is when it's near to me, but visible to both of us. So maybe something on my shoulder or something like that, which Miguel can see there in Sao Paulo. Or it could be at his end. I'm talking about something that I can see on his desk maybe, and it's near to him, far from me, but I'm still able to attend to it. Or it can be near me, but out of sight range for you. So you can see that as I move my hands off to the side of the screen, there are things which you can infer are here in my office in Canberra, maybe messy stuff on the floor or other stuff that you can't just see, my coffee cup just off to the side. All those things I would refer to using or, because it's a bit further away from me and it's not accessible to you or visible to you. And likewise at the other end, there are things which I know are out of sight for me, but not too far away from Miguel in either a real physical space or a larger extension of that space. So if I'm asking my Brazilian colleagues about Xingu languages, I would use yo, that is a fair way from Sao Paulo here, but much further from me here in Australia. And then oro, the distal form, would be used for things far from both of us. So if I'm talking about Benny del Parra or about the location of the Abui language in those little islands here in this part of Indonesia, thousands and thousands of kilometers away from here, even further away from Sao Paulo, I would use oro. Okay, so this is a system that has a very fine tracking of things, both in the my space and in the you space. And we're constantly, as we talk, trying to direct our attentions in a way that helps us to keep track of this unfolding universe we are building together as we speak, and that requires each of us to accommodate our attention to the other. Now, those were some exotic examples. You may or may not be familiar with Spanish or Turkish or Abui, but we can find complexities of double perspective right here in the languages that are, let's say, the three Abralin languages that Abralin talks have been given in: English, Portuguese, and Spanish. So this very peculiar speech event that had me confused for some time as I tried to work out when to put it in my calendar, where for me here in Canberra, it's Tuesday morning, and for at least those of you who are in Brazil, for example, it's Monday night. So I might say something like, I'll give my Abralin ao vivo talk on Monday evening in Sao Paulo. By then, Tuesday will have dawned in Canberra. You can probably see it's daylight here. So the future perfect in English, will have dawned, is requiring us to see the event of Tuesday dawning, the situation, from two perspectives at once. The speech event of me talking now, and the other event, the reference event, which might be, in this case, what's happening in Sao Paulo. Okay, so that's a future perfect. And then we have pluperfects. So when I gave my Abralin, say I'm telling you tomorrow now, when I gave my Abralin ao vivo talk on Monday evening in Sao Paulo, Tuesday had dawned already in Canberra, and the equivalent constructions in Portuguese and Spanish. So if we speak a West European language, it's an interesting point of historical aerial linguistics that the languages of Western Europe, whether they be Germanic or Romance languages, have developed these complex tense constructions, but they're not actually that common in languages around the world. Most parts of the world, you don't use these construction types, but it's helpful for us to use them here just to remind ourselves that we don't have to go out into the world of exotic languages to see some version of the phenomenon I'm talking about, which is the ability to see something from 2 points of view at once. In this case, from 2 temporal points of view in time. Now, I'd like to pass to another domain, which in a way it's sort of emotionally special for me, because when I grew up as a linguist and began to learn about these in Australian Indigenous languages, I thought they were incredible. I had to start learning about them from the first Australian Indigenous language I learned, which was Kayardild, and then later on in other ones like Biningunwok and Dalabon and Iwaja. In fact, all of the Australian languages I've learned have this phenomenon. And we all thought that this was just a thing that happened in Australian Indigenous languages and nowhere else. And then at some point, through my friend Patrick McConville, I heard about the work of Vanessa Lee in Brazil on Mebingokre, pardon me, I'm probably not pronouncing the language name properly, where the same thing occurs. So these are as far as I know at present, the 2 parts of the world which have these, what we can call triangular or tri-relational kin terms. And Vanessa's been using the word termos triagicus for the same things in Mebingokre. So the issue is this: when we talk about someone who is kin, especially in societies where everyone or nearly everyone is treated as kinship, as kin in some way, we have to decide, are we going to characterize that kin relation with respect to me, the speaker, like my sister-in-law, or with respect to you, the addressee, like your mother. Now in English, whether I say my mum or mum, well, let's say I say my mum, I'm making explicit. If I say your mum, I'm making explicit. If I say mum, I'm not making it explicit at all. And it's actually pragmatically determined. So I might say as a kid, oh, mum's gone out, and I'll mean my mum's gone out. Or I might ask a kid, is mum home? And I mean, is your mum home? And it could even be a third person if a childcare worker reports to another childcare worker, oh, that poor little kid's been crying all day because, mum's arriving late or something like that. But in none of those cases is the kinship relation being explicitly calculated with respect to two people. And what we will see, this initial Mebengokre example, the one who is your mother and my sister-in-law, is triangulating on someone by saying they're this relation to you and this other relation to me. So let's have a little look at how this works. I'll look at Gunderbi, which is a special speech register of language often known now as Biningunwok in Western Arnhem Land. So this is just one from well over 100 terms. The best description of this is in Murray Guard's great book on the use of kin terms in Biningunwok. So we have a sample situation. We've got three people talking, and there's a grandmother, a mother, and a daughter/granddaughter. So at the top right of the slide, you can see a little mini genealogical tree. And onto that, I have put the letters S for speaker, A for addressee, and R for referent. So the old lady talks to the younger girl about the middle-aged woman and refers to her using the expression algar, which we can translate as your mother equals my daughter, or the one who is your mother and my daughter, me being your maternal grandmother, if we want to spell it out fully explicitly. And the young girl would reply, still referring to the same person, as aldoingo, that is the one who is your daughter and my mother, me being your granddaughter through your daughter. So both of these terms and the well over 100 other terms in this register work by simultaneously triangulating on a referent from two perspectives. So they are an example of this double perspective in the domain of kinship. You might say, isn't this lexicon? I thought the title of the talk was The Grammar of Social Cognition. These are a little bit on the border. This is the most on the border of any of the phenomena which I will be talking about today, but it's a tightly structured area of the lexicon, and it has some special morphological properties. So the ngu suffix there, etymologically a your suffix, is found in a large number of these terms, and it's only found in Gunderbi terms. So it's a special morphological property associated with Gunderbi, for example. I should also say, to explain why you might have a system like this, that Biningunwok speakers rarely refer to people using names. That's a pretty gross thing to do inside that culture. So normally people get referred to using kinship, and this helps to resolve the inaccuracy of when we use a term like father, immediately the question arises, father of who? And by this triangular process, we can always resolve that clearly. So, as I said, this or a similar system has been described for at least one Brazilian language, Mebengokre. I'm sure it will turn up in others, and it may already have, and I just don't know. But it's been so well described first by Vanessa Lee, and then there's a more recent article by Marcela Coelho de Souza on this. And here are just a couple of examples. So this term Aporij Wush, I'm probably not pronouncing it properly, which means the one who is your niece and my daughter. And then this other term, which means the one who is your father and my sister-in-law, Iwanaje, and many other terms have the same logic. And to understand them, you can construct this triangle. There's a couple of different ways of representing it, as shown here, but essentially you need to calculate the relation of the speaker to the referent, of the addressee to the referent, and it's probably also a given that my relation to the addressee is of a certain type, like in the example before, when the young girl might say, you being my maternal grandmother. That's probably the best way to view it in semantic terms, is as a presupposition, but there are some interesting and delicate things that go on in conversation which would take us beyond what we can discuss now. Okay, so here's an interesting example. It's probably, as far as we know now, has been described only in 20, 25 languages, only in Australia and in the Brazilian Amazon. Will they turn up elsewhere? I'm sure they will. And we know that it took a long time for people to cotton on to their existence in these languages also. It requires sensitive, immersive fieldwork, and it doesn't just come up straight away. It certainly would not be discovered by elicitation, that old procedure which sometimes gets used, because the worst thing about elicitation is you only discover what you know to ask for. And the really exciting discoveries in language come from the things you don't know how to ask for because you don't know they exist yet. That's the case with, or was the case with these. Now, as another example of double perspective, I would like to turn to quoted speech. And there was another really interesting Abralin talk on Bakhtin. And of course, his great argument was not just about the novel and quoted speech and the fact that the novel allows us to move between other inner worlds through the thoughts and the quoted speech of the characters, but more broadly, we can see the whole language as originating like this. Another talk one could give might argue that all complex syntax originates in quoted speech. And I don't want to go down that line today, but it's something I actually believe. But all languages have ways of representing what other people say, and we do it quite a lot because that's an important part of our social world. That's how we know what's been going on in other people's worlds. And the simplest way to do this is direct speech, where we just reproduce a good approximation of other people's words. So if I just say, she said, I fell, which we represent in direct speech quotes in written English. And if we are speaking, it's often represented by some form of prosody or even an accent or whatever. And we calculate the dative values, the person, tense, and so on, from the original reported speech event. So whatever that person, wherever that person was at that time, and if that person was the speaker, you work out the I and the past tense from that. At the other extreme, we have indirect speech, where we assimilate the wording to the current speech event, or sorry, the reporting speech event. So if I say, she said, she had fallen, I'm locating the reporting speech event, she said, in the past with respect to now, and then taking a further step of reporting what had happened as she reported. She had fallen in our friend, the pluperfect, which we introduced earlier on. So now we're doing this double calculation of tense in English and a recalculation of person from I to she with respect to the primary speech event now, okay? So we've got a sort of double calculation that looks both at the primary speech event and the reporting speech event back to the original one. Now, the reason I introduced complex tense in English as a warm-up early on was that it's probably our best example in English, or the same would be true of Portuguese and Spanish, of what could be called biperspectival speech, where we have a grammatical construction, in this case, the pluperfect, which is simultaneously reflecting two viewpoints. The original viewpoint of what she said and the reporting viewpoint now. In the literature on reported speech, various terms have been used for this, like free indirect speech, still indirect libre, verschleierte Rede in the German tradition. They've been seeing it more as a stylistic device, and I'm focusing on it now more as a grammatical device. But of course, the two things are linked. Now, I'd like to show you another way that biperspectival speech can play out in the level of the pronoun systems. I'm going to give a Papuan example and a West African example. So in a number of Papuan languages, as far as we know, well, they're mainly from the Trans-New Guinea family, but also some others. So Usan, Golen, and so on. And I should say that there's a magnificent discussion of this in an article by Ger Reisink called Inner Speech in Papuan Languages, which you can just download online from Language and Linguistics in Melanesia. It's an open access online journal. He was the first person to really report on this. And then Robin Loughnane in an honours thesis at University of Melbourne, I think Celeste was actually there at that time, investigated this in another language called Golen. And what happens here is that when you have a reported clause, you follow two tracks in calculating the person of the subject on the one hand, which you do from the reported speech event, but the person of the object, which you do from the primary speech act. So let's look at how this works. We want to translate an English sentence like, they said they will hit us. This is what happens. Literally in Golen, you say, we hit us, they said. Now, let's sort of get inside this little cartoon we've got here. So we've got the boy and the girl talking, saying, reporting what these two adults said, right? So they're talking about they, the adults, and us, the boy and the girl. And then we have the two adults who are giving the threat. And what the adults, of course, said in English is, you know, we will hit you. But in the reported speech structure found in Golin, you do say we, that is, you're reporting what the adults really said, and you can see that by the bin suffix, which means we. So you report the subject as if it were direct speech, but the object here, inina, is reported as if it were indirect speech, right? So with respect to the primary reporting event. So this is this is just how you do reported speech in Golin, in Usan, in a number of other highlands Papuan languages. And we can see it as double perspective at the level of the whole construction. Each one of these individual morphemes just takes one perspective. But the construction, the instruction, how do you form a reported speech clause, have to draw on both these perspectives to be correctly expressed. Now that raises the question, well, could you have a double perspective played out just at the level of one morpheme? And you can, and this takes us to West Africa, where this phenomenon, often known as logophoric pronouns, is most richly developed. And Felix Ameke, in another Abralin talk, talked about this and gave, you know, a very insightful cultural embedding about why this might have developed so richly in West Africa because of the tradition of emissaries, linguists, as Felix said in his talk, whose job is to accurately reproduce the word of others, but somehow elaborate and beautify them at the same time. So this is the Agam language as reported by Larry Hyman. And in English, famously, we have an ambiguity if we say the woman said she fell, because if we turn those into direct speech, we could say the woman said she fell, or we could say the woman said I fell. And both of those turn into the woman said that she fell in indirect speech. But in languages with logophoric pronouns, that ambiguity is avoided by the choice of pronoun in the subject position of the reported speech. So here, when we've got this woman speaking, talking about a different woman falling, she uses the regular third singular or as the subject pronoun. But here, when the woman is talking about her falling herself, she uses the so-called logophoric pronoun e to refer to, I think the best way to see this is a she who is I, right? It's simultaneously she from one perspective and I from another perspective. So I think it's a useful way to see these logophoric pronouns, that there are some which are in other persons as well, in some languages, as taking that sort of double perspective that we saw in Golin, but now realizing it on a single morpheme instead of a whole construction. Now, when we talk or when we engage, we have to monitor the minds of others, or communication doesn't work. Of course, this is the hard thing about Zoom. If we were in a physical room, I could see your faces and I would know who's following, who's switched off, who's checking their mobile phones, all of those things. I can't at the moment. But in normal face-to-face communication, we're constantly doing that. And that shapes how we choose to present information. We had a workshop on social cognition at the ANU a couple of years back. And Paula Rubio Fernandez, who works at the sort of borderlines between philosophy and psychology, asked a question: is attributing mental states to others too costly as a basis for online interaction? Which online in the sense of doing it in real time, not in the sense of doing it through the internet. So she raised that question. I think it's a very interesting one. We know we can sit down and think it through, but when you're talking, as Steve Levinson and others have pointed out, you have to feed these decisions through at incredible speed. When you choose to form an utterance in a particular way, choose particular morphemes, you've got microseconds to do this. So this is really rapid processing you need to do. And that's what Paula is meaning when she's talking about online interaction. Now, we've already talked about demonstratives in Turkish and Abui and so on, which are our sort of primal scene for checking whether our addressee is attending to the same object. And we know this is, humans have been doing this for a long time, thanks to Alan Rumsey for bringing to my attention this altar relief from 1345 BC in an Egyptian tomb. And there you can see that we've got, the pharaohs and their little baby on the lap, drawing the baby's attention to the sun. So this is just a nice representation of how we as humans, from our earliest experiences as a child or or as a parent, directing our children's attention, making sure we're on the same page, as it were. Now, we know about this from demonstratives, and in a way, in our three Abralin languages, English, Spanish, Portuguese, we're used to doing it with definite articles, because to say the as opposed to a, or the equivalents in Spanish and Portuguese, basically we say it when we think that our addressee will know which one we're talking about. But what about with respect to a whole event, whether the person we are speaking to is switched on to that or not? And that leads us into this category that we've only begun to find out about, which I'm calling engagement. This was first described by the French Basque linguist Jean Landaburu, who has done a lot of work in Colombia and wrote a beautiful article in 2007 about this, about a Colombian language called Andoque, really quite an incredible language. So let's imagine this scene where sun's coming up and two people are watching it come up, and one says to the other, the day's dawning or the sun's coming up, and the crucial morpheme to attend to here is this be, because this is a language auxiliary base, and you've got to fill this grammatical slot by one of four morphemes, which I'll show you in a second. And here the choice of the be indicates we can both see this. I'm aware of this, and I think you are too. So we can call this plus speaker plus addressee engagement. That's the gloss I'm using here. Landaburu uses a slightly different gloss, and he's writing in French, but I'm hoping I'm doing justice to the spirit of his analysis. And the important thing is in his article that we're dealing with relations of epistemic authority between a speaker and a hearer. And that's going into the grammar. It's inside the grammatical system. It's not just a pragmatic thing. Now, contrast this first sentence, which is the one we've already seen, where we're both attending to it, with the second one, where I'm talking and maybe you're looking somewhere else, or maybe you're still asleep or whatever. And now, by choosing qu'un as the auxiliary base instead of the be, I'm indicating this is something that I don't think you are attending to. Hey, please attend to this. I'm witnessing it. I don't think you are. Okay. And then there's a couple of other ones. So, as a good French structuralist, we have Landebroek constructs this nice 2x2 matrix, which is sort of plus or minus speaker knowledge, or probably knowledge and attention, and plus or minus addressee. And then there's a couple of alternatives for one cell. Absolutely beautiful analysis, incredibly elegant and insightful, but there's just a couple of examples. He also wrote a grammar of Andoke a couple of decades earlier and doesn't mention them. And then there's no verifiable recording of context, and a skeptic could just say, well, look, these are just particles. Like, surely you could just translate this into English with words like hey, or something like that. So Landebroek definitely has discovered something here, but as linguists, to understand what's going on, firstly, we should look at more languages to see if it's there as well, but also we need new methods. And this is what started to happen in the last decade or so. I'm going to mention three languages which are completely unrelated to each other or to Andoke, where we've begun to see similar systems. So one is still in Colombia, Kogi, but it's a Chibchan language. It's a little, it seems to be at best a sort of aerially stimulated development rather than an inherited one. So work by Henrik Bergqvist and Dominique Knuchel has been investigating this. Then Marind, which is a trans-New Guinea language of southern New Guinea, investigated by Bruno Olsen, and Murinpata, which is an Australian language of southern Daly region, Northern Australia, investigated by John Mansfield. And in each of these, we have engagement expressed not just by an auxiliary base, but by an inflection on the verb itself. And each of these three investigators has used methods which shows the unfolding conversational context very clearly. Either videos of a narrative task. There's this family problems narrative task that we've developed as part of a project building what we call parallax corpora on social cognition across about 30 languages around the world, or on naturalistic videos of speech in attentional context. That's what Bruno Olsen was doing for Marind, or on conversational analysis, which is what John Mansfield's been doing with Murinpata. So I'm going to briefly show you how this works. But firstly, just for Kogi, to show you that we've got a series of verbal inflections, we can see that the NAT, for example, focuses on speaker access without the addressee access happening. And then the other combinations are here. So, for example, if you ask me what I'm doing, maybe you're upstairs and I'm downstairs and having a great dance away, and you say, "Hey, what are you doing down there, Nick? Oh, what's all that thumping?" And I say, "Oh, look, I'm really dancing," right? I would use the na form, and the nuku is the verb. So this is a prefix onto the verb. On the other hand, if you could see me, So you're already aware of this, I would say ninuku with the ni prefix. And I won't go through all of the prefixes. You can read Henrik's really nice analysis to do that. But the important thing is here we have a series of prefixal choices onto the verb which encode these assumptions. And what's different about this compared to our Turkish demonstratives, for example, is we're talking about events, not just entities, and we're talking about verbal inflections, not just demonstratives. So Henrik's first descriptions came up through fairly standard fieldwork combination of elicitation, pursuing questions, learning to speak the language. But now with Dominique Knuchel's work, who's doing a PhD with Henrik and doing, or has been doing, extensive fieldwork, also looking at other sources. So this is the family problems picture task that I mentioned. The idea here is that speakers have a number of cards and they're trying to work out what's going on and then form them into a coherent story. And in this little section, the speech is being constructed by this guy here who's causing trouble by passing on gossip to this guy here. And he's saying, your wife's doing this without you knowing, you see. So this guy's claiming to have seen his wife, seen the other guy's wife flirting at the market or something. And this form here, nagichi, is glossed a speaker asymmetric form. So the speaker knows it. He's seen a wife flirting at the market, and the addressee doesn't know it yet. It's news to him. So twice in this little passage, that particular form's being used. So this shows us that with the right sort of methods for investigating naturalistic speech, which is a goal of that family problems task, we can start to see systematically how these forms get used. I'd like to now pass to Southern New Guinea, where Bruno Olsen has been working on the Marind language, which was described by the missionary linguist Draba as Peter Draba as the most complicated Papuan language. And I don't think anyone's proved him wrong yet. And Draba was quite an amazing person, very perceptive linguist. But despite having worked on Marind for many, many years and written a grammar that's really good grammar in a lot of ways, he was just baffled. He gave these two series, which we'll call Roman 1 and Roman 2. One has this prefix ep and some other forms on it, and the other doesn't have the prefix. So you can compare noizige, I am sharpening, and epanoizige, I'm sharpening, and so on for the other forms. And he wrote in Dutch that we couldn't find any difference of meaning between the forms. He just was baffled. And Marind has famously complex verb morphology. Why go to the trouble of having two series if they don't do something for you, if they don't mean something? Well, Bruno Olsen did his PhD on this a few years ago from Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, and went out there and actually recorded people talking and made some very interesting video recordings. And here's one. I want you, of course, we're not focusing on the morphology here in detail, but it's this prefix here. You can see the telltale P. The gloss abscondative is what Bruno uses for one of those series, and that's supposed to mean, well, we'll explain what it means in a second, but first of all, let's look at the context. So we've got the older guy you'll see in a red shirt. He's trying to get the young guy in the green shirt to take his clothes off and have a bath in the well. And the little boy in the green shirt wants to distract him. So he cooks up a story about seeing a little fish at the bottom of the well. And this is what happens. Okay, so that's the supposed little fish. We're not sure if there really was one, that doesn't matter. But the little boy is saying, look, there's a little fish swimming around inside. So he's saying ade, which you might translate as, hey, look, or something, or hey. But crucially, there on this verb here is the prefix with the P, the number 1 series that Drabo was mystified by. And that belongs to what Bruno Olsen calls the Abscondative, which is one value on the engagement dimension that says, hey, I'm aware of this. I don't think you are. Pay attention to it. So by choosing that form, the boy is directing the addressee's attention to an event designated by a verb, which he, the speaker, the little boy, thinks that the addressee, the guy in the red shirt, is not aware of. Okay. So we'll move on. So this relates to the idea that Jacques Dubois has written about of stance. That is, when we speak, we position ourselves with respect to what we're talking about. We've got 2 subjects in the sense of, psychological subjects, and we're aware of each other's engagement with the world, and we're constantly evaluating where our interlocutor is and positioning ourselves with the interest of achieving alignment in order to communicate successfully. And that stance triangle, as Dubois called it, has been elaborated by Bergqvist and Knuchel in their own discussions of engagement as stance. So you can see that we've still got the same basic architecture, but now we're looking at the relative degree of access. So can I attend to it or not? Am I sure what's there? Same with you. There are things I know about and you don't. There are things you know about and I don't. Same for attention. Things we both know about, things that neither of us know about. Most of language, actually. That is the still to be discovered things. And then here, epistemic authority is who do I, as speaker, think knows more about that. There will be some things that I know more about, some things that I think you know more about, some things where I think, well, we both know this already. So this is, I think, a very useful reconfiguring of Dubois' stance triangle that helps us make sense of how this emerging grammatical phenomenon of engagement works. Now, for my last domain in which we can talk about double perspective, I'd like to talk about evidence. So we know fairly well now that lots of languages have systems of evidentials that make grammatical encodings of basically how we know what we know through seeing something, through hearsay, through inference, whatever. But a lot of the discussion on evidentials uses unfortunate labels like visual evidence or hearsay that duck the question of whose evidence that is. If I just label an evidential as visual evidence, does that mean I saw it, you saw it, we saw it, Celeste saw it, whatever? there's an implication that it's either me or you, but it's not particularly overt. We find, though, that there are systems that do make this overt. And I'm going to talk about a number of Papuan systems here. Foe and Walla are the two I'm going to focus on, but Duna and Oksapmin also have this, and some other Papuan languages as well. And once again, we see this nice, it's like this sort of El Nino resonance between the Western Pacific and the Eastern Pacific, because in Nambiquara, in the Amazon, Croker has also described a system like this. So what we see here is that the phenomenon of engagement that we've just been discussing, that is speakers' assessment of what the addressee knows or attends to, scopes over the evidentials, not just over the event itself. And that gives contrasts like directly witnessed by me, but not you, directly witnessed by both of us, and so on. So this is just part of a verbal suffix paradigm stripped out from the grammatical sketch of Foe by Murray Rule. So here you can see this is a typical Papuan language with a lot of tense distinctions: present, near past, far past, future, and so on. And then we've got, this doesn't show all of them, but these are both something like visual or direct evidence, evidentials. That is, this is directly known through direct human experience, but the contrast is known to speaker but unseen by the addressee. For example, Bora in the present tense, or Ra maybe fairly recently in the past, or seen by both the speaker and the addressee. So now I'm showing who knows about the evidence for this. Let's look at this in a bit more detail for a different Papuan language. Walla, described by the anthropologist Paul Silito. You can see it's got quite a complex system of verbal morphology. So this is the verb by, to do, with agreement for different subjects, first, second, third person, singular, dual, plural, past, recent past versus distant past, and then these different, what I would call engagement combinations according to who is the one to have done or be doing the witnessing. So let's look at three examples visualized out of his descriptions in the article. So he gives the example of knowing about agriculture. So how do we know what we should do in growing a particular plant? What will thrive? How do we plant it? How do we tend it? What will make us prosper as a community? Here is traditional knowledge where both people have done it together. They're talking about something they both know about because they've done it together. So the form bisumindis, which would mean we did it, both speaker and hearer witnessed, would be used. The second example in the middle is where we have an agricultural officer coming in and telling people in the village about what's supposed to happen. Saying, oh, those other people, you know, in this other community, they planted this crop and it really thrived and they became wealthy or something. So here, this biso, this guy would be telling about what someone else did. The speaker witnessed it, but the addressees did not. They have to take his word about the validity of the evidence. And then, of course, there are situations where you're just talking about things that neither of you know about. So we've represented that here by two people talking about something happening in Indonesia, which is just like, it's rumored that people grow rice this way or something. He did it, but neither of us have actually witnessed it ourselves. So as Silito argues in this article down the bottom, I really recommend it. It's not often that discussions of grammar, in particular evidential systems, get turned to really vital practical questions in development, theory of development, and this is a beautiful article of that. But he points out that the whole process by which well-meaning governments come in communities and tell them, yeah, you should do this, this is how you should change your agricultural practices and so on, they will only work inside a culture if the transition from knowledge of one person to knowledge shared on the experience of all is made. And people are naturally suspicious of what is told them by so-called experts or outsiders. This is a culture where you only fully trust what you have seen with your own eyes and done yourselves. So starting to wrap up now and asking ourselves what double perspective, in the many forms in which I have discussed it, teaches us about social cognition, what psychologists have called theory of mind, that is, knowing that others don't necessarily share your take on the world, is absolutely central to social cognition. The grammar of others, the grammar of living among others, depends crucially on this and on constantly modulating our models of what each person knows and of bringing them into some form of harmony, at least enough of the time to communicate. What's fascinating is that so many languages have grammatical systems to do this. Online, in that sense of in real time, a wide range of domains: datic space, time, kinship, attention to events, evidence. We'll find others as well, I'm sure. This shows that it's fundamental to human interaction. But most of the languages which have this phenomenon, you will have seen that most of the languages I've been using in this talk aren't well-known world languages spoken by hundreds of millions of people. But one of the great things about linguistics, I think this is what makes it such a profoundly democratic field in its potential, is that in the marginalia, to use the term from Felix Ameka's talk, that is societies which unfortunately have been regarded as marginal by colonizing powers and by universities in first world countries and so on. They teach us the deepest lessons often outside the well-studied languages of the Eurocentric mainstream. And this is how we will come to understand the full significance of double perspective for linguistics. So to really incorporate this into our models of language, we need to make some big theoretical shifts. We have to move from truth functional, which about the world, which is out there without any reference to us apprehending the world. That shifted to cognitive semantics, starting from the 80s really, where the role of humans in seeing and thinking about the world began to be appreciated. But now we really need to move to intercognitive semantics, where we are seeing meaning as something that is achieved in dialogue between two or more humans, adjusting their view of what's out there to what each thinks the other knows or is attending to. New phenomena are coming up at an exciting rate. All of these things I've been talking about, we've only really begun to discover them in the last few years. So they're new phenomena. They require new models, but they also require new methods for us to discover them and understand them. And the single most important thing is the use of video recording, which allows us to study the mutual tracking and modification of attention in context. Whether in the leftmost one, it was, Uzurek and Kita looking at inside a particular pottery studio, or Dominic Knuchel's work with Coggy recording people, telling a story with a task, or the more naturalistic video use by Bruno Olsen with Marind. In all of these cases, we can really see where people's eyes are going, what they're pointing to, how they're adjusting to each other's attention. And a final word, just a reminder that each language has something different to teach us. Ludwig Wittgenstein said that we must plow over the whole of language. He used it in the singular, language, and in German, die ganze Sprache. Of course, it's ambiguous. When we say language as linguists, we mean everything that language can be, everything that languages can be. In other words, which languages? We have to really understand that each language is helping us solve part of the puzzle, and that in fact social cognition might yet prove to be the most variable semantic domain in grammar, might be the one where we find the most difference in how languages organize it, but it's arguably the one that's most fundamental to the evolution of language, so we better understand it. So just in closing, I'd like to give my special thanks to Abralin and to Miguel Oliveira for organizing this and for enabling my here in Canberra to be your here, wherever you are in the world listening to this, and you're there to be my there as I think about what it's like to be a linguist in Brazil or anywhere else in the world, as we move to being a worldwide community of lovers of language. That's a transformation which Abralin has set us on the path of. So, muito obrigado. Thank you. And thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Nick, for your very interesting presentation. We now have some questions from the chat. So when you're ready, are you ready for the first question? It's about online communication, not in the sense of in real time, but online, as we're doing now. So the question is, has there been much research on how demonstratives are adapted for online communication, like in Zoom? So the use of demonstratives, like you were referring to at the beginning, seems like a good time for it.
Yeah. Look, it's a great question. I'm not able to answer it. I don't actually know if what there has been. I'm sure there are people in the audience who do know, and I hope they'll use one of the potentialities of Zoom, which is simultaneously putting information in through chat. There are bound to, if I'll use a minus speaker epistemic authority plus addressee epistemic authority, I'm sure there are people out there in the listenership who know the answer to that question, but unfortunately I don't. I can just say it's a great and an interesting thing to look at, and I hope people are or will.
Thank you, Nick. There's another one. Hi, Nick. Not sure if this is 100% related, but I am curious on your opinion about the NSM approach to describing kin terms in Kaya Dild. and other Australian languages. So your opinion about the NSM approach to describing King terms in Kayardild and potentially other Australian languages?
Yeah. Oh boy, this is something that is a debate that's been running over many years, and in the sort of worldwide geography of our people discussing it here, just 200 meters down the road from me, here where I am, is the house of the great Anna Wisbicka, who developed this NSM approach. So that's a conversation we can have extremely locally. But I really like some aspects of NSM, and there are other ones that I have problems with. The things I like about it are that it deconstructs a term like, mother or father. Obviously, we can't just treat that as unproblematic. We know, for example, that in the modern world, as reproductive technologies get more and more complicated, the notion of what is a real mother, if I can use that in inverted commas, there's ever more possibilities, but also in traditional societies where you have the mother who's giving birth, the mother who's the one who you're very close to emotionally, the one who is a classificatory mother. In Kayardild, there would be 3 terms that you would could use for that. So I could say Ngidin Barrier, which means, the one who carried me in her womb. I could say Gulakol, which is like mummy. That is someone who raised me, and there could be several people in that category who, maybe I'd breastfed from several of them, and I have that close relation to several. And there's Namatu, which is mother in the category of mother, which would be an 1/8 of the women in the Kayardild world, because it's a world where everyone is kin and mother is an important category. So my mother's sister would also be a Namatu. So on the one hand, I find that NSM is really good for deconstructing, what does Namatu mean here? But in terms of the logic of working outwards to hundreds, possibly thousands of people, at some point you need to start using a shorthand and working out rules of logic that don't keep jumping down to that level of complexity. So in discussing kin, I mean, this is where I begin to have issues. What anthropologists call the relative product. So if I have, let's say I characterize a cross cousin, nice compact word in the sort of anthropology of kinship, and then I say, well, a cross cousin is the child of an opposite sex sibling. So my mother's brother's child or my father's sister's child. You might have had to do a double take if you're not used to talking about kinship, but it's pretty compact. Now, if I have to start unpacking each one of those sibling, mothers, brothers, and so on into a quite lengthy definition, it becomes a cumbersome way of talking about kinship. So just as we have involution in the brain, where we have sort of layering upon layering upon layering in the cortex, where things become more efficient as you set up these sort of shortcuts, many aspects of NSM are great for talking about that sort of earliest levels of approaching one concept and unpacking it. But once you start to chain them together in a way that you have to in societies where reasoning about kinship is quite complex and habitual, it becomes a cumbersome tool. So that's my answer to the question.
Thank you. So we've got another question. It's more of a comment turned question, so I'll read it out to you. Is it fitting that logic has turned exactly that way, independently of linguistics, from classical logic to multi-agent systems?
Yeah, it's totally fitting. And it's, again, another of the Abralin talks that I have enjoyed watching is the one by John Goldsmith. And I was thinking of his talk of the sort of moles going, under from one garden and appearing in another, and how often this happens in science, that essentially the same idea will pop up in different scientific fields. And we need that, actually. We need that to understand what's going on, because we can never understand one field of science without reference to the others. And another thing that John Goldsmith said in his talk was that one of the key insights of generative linguistics was the need to remove subjectivity in determining what the phenomenon is you're describing. It's easy to be misconstrued here. So if I'm talking about subjectivity or intersubjectivity in language, that doesn't mean you are stepping back from the scientific responsibility to say all of our claims should be independently verifiable. It's the opposite for me. And that's why I think the sorts of investigations which I was talking about near the end, where we bring in video recordings of interactions and we can actually see where people are gazing, or we look at long transcribed conversations and see how topics progress through them, we can then check. We make a claim, this engagement marker is, minus speaker, epistemic authority or whatever. Then we make a prediction and we look against that. So we want to be able to model that explicitly. Logic is indispensable to doing that. And having these types of multi-agent logics which say, hey, come on, let's get with the game, guys, let's really look at this much more complex world we live in. It's a really welcome step, and it'll take that dialogue between linguistics and logic to a much more new and interesting level.
Thank you. Another question, can we say that even old known phenomena should be studied from this new perspective? For example, male and female speech, as in Karaja. So can we say that even old known phenomena should be studied from this new perspective? For example, male and female speech, as in Karaja.
Yeah. So I think that's just a general thing in the field of linguistics that often, one view is that everything you find in each language is present in other languages. It's just configured differently. And some languages will display in a very elegant form what is much more subtle and elusive in another one. So what's present in grammar or in a beautifully elegant paradigm like that sort of 2x2 engagement paradigm of Andoke, it's not that it's communicatively absent from English. Of course, we find ways of doing that, but they are much more heterogeneous, how we have to go about doing it. So it's easy just to think of them as being more peripheral. And it's this particular example of male and female speech. It's an interesting one because it varies a lot according to the language. But when you have speech communities that have these sometimes, completely grammaticalized differences between male and female speech, like an Australian Indigenous example would be Yanua, where the number of noun classes, which are, elaborate gender system, there's 7 in the male speech version and 8 in the female speech version. This has been described by John Bradley. So basically you collapse, if you're in the male speech version, you collapse, if I remember rightly, male animals and male humans, which are distinguished in a female version. But it's not like the guys never get a chance to speak the female speech, because in giving reported speech, like if I say, and then Celeste said, if I'm doing a good job of it, I reproduce your grammatical system. So it's not just that we have to learn one role, but thanks to this dialogicity of language and this Bakhtinian idea that we are constantly representing other thought worlds and other speech worlds, by doing that, we develop, as we mature as language users, the ability to represent things from these other ways. So I can't speak about the particular Karajat situation, which I don't know, but looking at how those processes of representing others comes right back to the bispectival phenomena of represented speech that I was talking about in the talk. So that's just one example of how useful it would be to do that.
Thank you. I've got another question. Hi, Nick. Will you consider that the we inclusive versus the we exclusive has something to tell us about the issues you've presented us today? So will you consider that the we inclusive and the we exclusive forms have something to tell us about the issues you spoke about today?
Yeah, well, I think they do. And I actually wrote a little squib in Brain and Behavioral Sciences. There was a very interesting article some years back arguing for what it called second person neurocognition. That is, studies of neurocognition by neuropsychologists have been first person based. And this very interesting research group based in Cologne was saying, well, a lot of what we do is you based. We're getting into your thought, but that's not the end of it, because there's also, me modeling what you do and what we do together. It's a very important part of it. And of course, this grammatical contrast, which English lacks when we just say we, between we inclusive, me and you, and we exclusive, me and someone else. When you have to learn another language that has it, or coming the other way, when someone from that learns English, it is rather different. And you do start having to pay attention. If I say, we'll go out, I immediately have to check, am I inviting you or not? But perhaps even more so in reporting something in the past. Let's say you and I, Celeste, are talking about something that happened in Melbourne, back in 2007 or 2006, at that period you so kindly referred to. And I might say, we went to such and such a seminar by Michael Klein. And I have to start remembering whether you went to that seminar or not, because in order to say we inclusive, I need to know whether you did. Whereas if I'm just saying it in English, I just don't have to worry about that. So as Dan Slobin has always pointed out, thinking for speaking is important in language. Every grammatical category shapes how you think in the act of producing sentences, but it's deeper than that, because we have to remember for speaking and we have to attend for speaking. Everything we do, we might be called upon to report in 10 years or 20 years' time to other members of our culture. And what we need to attend to now is partly shaped by projecting forward to those future communicative needs. And if we have an inclusive pronoun in our language, all of a sudden, we've got to be a bit more attentive. Now, it's a huge challenge for linguistics to take an insight like that, which is basically a humanistic or philological insight, and I'm just expressing it. And someone could say, oh, Nick, yeah, you just say that it's bullshit. You know, like, how do we know if it's really true? Let's get out there and measure it. And absolutely, we do have to. It's just hard to do it. And it's a challenge for our field, but I hope we'll find a way. But the first step is that the grammar raises the question. The grammar throws the question in our face when we do description of a particular language, and we can spend decades working out what all the ramifications of the question are and how to deal with them. But we've started that process. So it's an excellent question. And yeah, I hope we'll be able to answer it in a less intuitive way in 10 years' time.
Thank you, Nick. I think that's all we have time for today. Thanks a lot once again for your wonderful presentation. Thank you, Abralin. Thank you, Miguel. Please take good care of yourselves and of each other, and see you soon. Goodbye.
Yeah. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.